Web server administration. In this nugget, we're going to start off with the thing that makes IIS the most useful, web servers. We'll start by covering basic website settings, website bindings. We'll look at virtual directories, how to configure logging, how to configure MIME types for files, and the important differences between site configuration and server-wide or master configuration, and we'll look at where the configuration lives in the web config file. And I'll even tell you why you should really care about those web config files. So here we go. So let's start by opening IIS Manager, and I'm just going to start by creating a brand new site. I know I've got the default website in there already, but let's ignore that for a minute and add a website. So we're going to call this sample site. I'll need to decide which application pool to put it into. Now, we're going to talk about app pools in the next nugget, but just know that when you create a new website, by default, IIS will create a new application pool for it, so that every website goes in its own application pool. It's not quite what I want, so I'm just going to select the default app pool, so that a new one doesn't get created. Now, I need to have a directory for this website to function off of, so what I'm going to do is browse to C inetpub www.root. So that's the root of my default website. So let's make a new folder called www2 root. And back in IIS, we will set that inetpub www2 root as the physical path. Now, if this is going to be on a UNC, which is possible, then you can specify different credentials. Actually, for any folder, you can specify different credentials, what you want it to connect as. By default, it will connect as the identity of the application itself, which is something we're going to talk about a little bit in nugget number 5, but more in nugget number 8, where we talk about security. What I will tell you is this, that if you're going to be getting your files from anything other than a local hard disk, even if you're doing some funky mapping so that it looks like a local folder but it's really coming across the network, just make sure it's really high performance. That network bandwidth that's utilized in pulling files over to the server can be one of the biggest bottlenecks. So the next thing is binding. Right now we can only create one binding. The default website automatically goes to the HTTP protocol on port 80 to all IP addresses with no host name. We need to have something different. Every set of bindings must be unique. So what we're going to say is that this is port 8080. So now any HTTP requests that come over to port 8080 are going to go to our new website. And we will select the option to start the website immediately. We'll talk more about bindings in just a second. So I've got two websites now. So if I open up Internet Explorer, and I just go to localhost, IE defaults to port 80 for HTTP connections, so let's make sure we tell it HTTP. And this is my default website. This is the first one. If I specify port 8080, server error in application sample site. The web server is configured to not list the contents of its directory. Because I didn't specify a web script to run, and because there aren't any files in that directory that I created, IIS's only option would be to show me the directory structure, and it's not configured to allow that, so it returned an error. So those are the basic settings for a site. We can edit those anytime we want to over here in Basic Settings. And all this is the application pool it goes to and the physical path. The bindings is the next thing we can do. Let's do a picture for the bindings. The bindings are kind of an important deal, and they can be a little tricky to understand sometimes. So you've got 4 aspects to a binding. The first is the protocol. The next is the IP address. The next is the port. And the next is the host header. And so the 4 of these must be uniquely specified for every website. So your first website, the default one, is usually HTTP, and it's all unassigned. So any IP address that has not been assigned to another website falls as unassigned. Port 80 and no header. The one I just created was HTTP, all unassigned, port 8080, with no host header. I might create another website that's HTTP, all unassigned, and on port 80, but this will only respond if the host header is, say, nuggetlab, lab.com. So if somebody types http nuggetlab.com, IIS's kernel mode listener will go, okay, let's see, we've got an HTTP request to such and such an IP address, whatever it happens to be. No port was specified, so port 80 was the default, and they were asking for nuggetlab.com. So HTTP all unassigned port 80 nuggetlab.com. I will dispatch the request to website number 3. However, let's say somebody asked for www.nuggetlab.com. So IIS, the kernel mode listener, is going to come and say, okay, it's HTTP, so that means it's one of these guys. It's a such and such an IP address. Well, these are all unassigned, so it's one of those. It's port 80. All right, well, that lets this guy out. And the host header is www.nuggetlab.com. Well, this is nuggetlab.com, but not www. So I'm going to direct the request to this one, which is taking all host headers. So you do have to be a little bit careful. If you're using host headers to separate websites, which is a really common trick, you need to make sure you put all the potential host headers in there. A lot of, with the scarcity of public IP addresses, a lot of web servers only have one IP address assigned, which means that in DNS, if someone looks up nuggetlab.com, they're getting, let's say it's 15.16.17.18. Let's say that's the IP address. And this is when they look up nuggetlab.com in DNS. That's not the actual IP, but let's just say. And then let's say they look up cbtnuggets.com, and DNS says 15.16.17.18. Well, both of these are going to be HTTP requests. They're both going to be on port 80. So this host header is the only way IIS has to tell the difference between them to make sure that you get to the right website. If we wanted to also have www.nuggetlab.com, well, IIS has got to be told that www.nuggetlab.com is being handled by this particular website. So that's where the bindings come into play. Now, when you create a new website, you only create one binding, but you can add more. You can add as many as you want. Any way that someone is going to be accessing this website has got to be listed here. If I just do this, HTTP, all unassigned IP addresses, port 80, no host name, it's telling me that binding is already assigned to another site. If I have two websites with duplicate bindings, let me just go ahead and do this. Yes. It stopped my website. And if I try to start it, I can't start it because another website and the error message says maybe using the same port. In reality, there's another website using the same 4-part binding. So the only way to fix this is to go back into the bindings, remove the one that's a duplicate, close this, and now it will let me start the website because now IIS can uniquely identify incoming requests for that website. So those are the basic settings and those are the bindings. Once you're there, let's see, it's going to www2 root. Let's create a new text document. Let's call it default.htm. Yep, change it. Let's open this with Windows Notepad. We'll just make a quick little HTML page. We will save that. Now let's try Internet Explorer again, and we get our HTML page brought up. So that's really all you have to do to get a basic website up and running. Now from there, you start to get to customize it. One of the first things you might want to do is start to set up a folder structure. There's two ways to do this. You can just go into C, inetpub, www.root, that's www2 root. You can just start creating folders in here. Maybe we're going to put sales stuff in here, and maybe we're going to keep our images in this folder, and so forth and so on. When you come up here, let me refresh this, you'll see that folder structure laid out. And you can drop files in here, and any file that's in here will be accessible from the internet or intranet. It'll be accessible to web browsers. Sometimes you may want to include something in the website that you don't want to include under here. For example, let's say I've got a file server out there that's got some shared some shared folders, obviously, and some documents, and I want to include those documents in my website, but they live on a different server. Option one would be to just copy them in here, but then I'd have two copies floating around. So a virtual directory lets me do this. I'm going to add a virtual directory, and the alias is what it appears to be to the web. So let's just call this docs. And then I can give it a physical path. This can either be a path to the local computer, or it can be a path to a UNC. Keep in mind that if it's going to be a path to a UNC and there's not really good network connectivity, then I'm going to be slowing things down because the web server is going to have to retrieve this file. Now I need to tell it, since this is a UNC, I need to decide how the authentication is going to work. This is going to use pass-through authentication, which means the user of the application it'll be their credentials. If the user is connecting anonymously, then it will be the identity of the worker process that's handling this request, and we're going to talk about that more in nugget number 5 and nugget number 8. If I have enabled some means of authentication, like basic authentication, then the user can be prompted for their credentials, their username and their password, and that will be used to connect to this UNC. So whatever user is connecting, either a specific user, which I can set, and it's going to store the password, or the application's credentials, the user's credentials, that's what's going to be used. If they don't have permissions, then they're not going to get through. In this case, I'm connecting to an administrative share. So let's look what happens here. I'm going to go back into Internet Explorer. And let's just see. Let's see something in the root of my C drive that I can try and access, because that's where I mapped this all to. So let's just go to C. We've got top10.html in the root of the C drive. So what I should be able to do is localhost 8080 docs, because that's the virtual directory that takes me to the root of the computer's C drive. Top10.html. Internal error. And it's because I couldn't get to that because I'm accessing it anonymously. As far as the browser is concerned, I'm nobody. So no credential was passed through. That means it's the identity of the worker process that was used to access this UNC, and that worker process identity is not an administrator, and only administrators can access those administrative shares. So that's what happens when you set up a virtual directory and you don't get the whole permission thing kind of working all at the same time. So I'm going to remove this virtual directory. It's a lot more common to actually see virtual directories that point to a local folder. For example, let me create another one here, add a virtual directory. We're going to call this docs as well and just point it to the root of my C drive, which is technically outside the web path. So let's try this again. This time it got to it because I didn't have to be an administrator to go through that $$ share. I was just going straight to a file on the hard drive. And if we were to look at the NTFS permissions on that file, we'd see that it probably has, read rights for all domain users or something like that. So that's why I was able to get to it. So we'll remove that virtual directory. And setting those up is a great way to bring multiple different places, files together into a single location. Next up is logging. So let's keep with our sample site here and scroll down until we find the logging component. There she goes. We can kind of configure the logging however we want to. By default, we get one log file per site. We are going to pick the format. W3C is the most common because that's the format you can feed to just about any kind of log analyzing tool or statistics tool, and it knows how to read that. However, you may want to go in and select fields, particularly if you plan to feed your logs to something like an analysis program or something else. You want to grab all the fields, particularly the bytes sent and received, the host, because that's going to allow your analyzer to distinguish between different websites, and cookie, because that's what allows your analyzer to distinguish between users. I also like to throw refer in there too. That lets your analyzer tell you who came to your website from another website. And if you're going to check all those, just why not check all of them? So you can turn on all of the fields so that whatever's looking at your log file has the most information to work with. Specify the directory where you want it to go, how often you want the log files to roll over. You can say hourly, daily, weekly, monthly. Daily is common. You can have them build up to a certain size and then roll over, or just never roll over, which means everything continually logs to one growingly gigantic file, which really makes no sense. These use GMT to start with universal time constant. Actually, UTC, you can force it to use local time. The only thing that can create some confusion there is when you're rolling over from day to day, it can kind of get confusing as to what data goes with which day. When you're done, make sure you apply your changes, and then that's all you have to worry about. This content view just kind of lets you get back to the website content if you're wondering what that is. Features view is what's giving us this actual feature. So let's go back to the main screen. The majority of the time, you're going to log to a file. You're going to log to a W3C file. If you don't want logging at all, if you're running a website where you just do not need logging, this is not where you turn it off. Logging gets turned off in a different location. We will run across that presently. This is just configuring what the logging is going to be when it is enabled. Now, the tricky thing in IIS is that every single one of these nodes has its own configuration that inherits from the one above it. So if I click on this folder here and scroll down, you can see that I have another section of logging here. This will default, and you can see how it's inheriting. So these are all grayed out. If I had a virtual directory, it would actually let me change these things on a per virtual directory basis. So you could have some virtual directories where the traffic wasn't logged. This inheritance actually goes all the way back up to the server level. And this is where we can talk about the master configuration versus the site-specific configuration. Scroll down to the IIS portion and get into the logging. Here, now you can see I can change all of these settings. This was disabled before. Instead of having one log file per site, I can choose to just have one log file for the entire server, so that all traffic to this entire server will get dumped into one place. If you do that, it is especially important to make sure that you're including the host information, because that will help the log file distinguish which website the traffic was going to, since all the website traffic is just being dumped into a single file. A neat trick is you can just go in here and change this at the top level, and when you apply it, it will automatically carry down to all of the other websites. So now if I go to the default website and go down to its logging, remember I didn't modify this before, but when I do select fields, they're all now pre-selected because it's inheriting that from the top level. Things like encoding are also inherited from that level. So that's kind of the difference between the master and the subsidiary configuration. If you configure something here, then it will override at a lower level. With many things, you can go in at the lower level, like logging, and I can now deselect fields. So I'm overriding the inherited all field selection. Some things, like one log file per site or server, I can't override at this level. If I want to change that, if you see something grayed out, it means it needs to be configured at a higher level. So I do not want to save those changes. So that's configuring the logging. Next up is MIME types. Now this is something that you usually do configure here at the top level, at the server level, rather than on a per site basis. And you'll find it down here under IIS, the MIME types. This tells IIS what to do with every possible file extension that this web server needs to serve up. For example, if we scroll to the bottom and look for a zip file, when a user requests a file with a .zip file name extension, IIS will send it, and it will send it as an application /x-zip-compressed. Most web browsers will interpret that. They'll interpret anything with application, usually, as a file that needs to be downloaded and saved, versus something that's going to be displayed within the web browser. Now that's not always the case. Every web browser can decide how it's going to handle each MIME type. If we go up to, let's find CSV. Here we go. This is an application octet stream. So what I've done in my website is I've copied in a CSV file right here, and here in IIS you can see that I've requested that, and it did display it. So, sorry, in IE. IE has chosen to display the contents of a CSV file. It receives them and then displays them. So every web browser can make its own decision. The trick is, if a file does not have a listing in here, then the web server will not serve that file type. So I'm going to go down to the sample site, and I'm going to go to MIME types, and I'm going to come down to the CSV one, cbdp CSV, and I'm going to delete it. Yes, I want to remove that type. Now, just to make sure that that took, I'm going to stop the web server, website. The other websites are still running. And then I'm going to start it back up again. Come back here to IE and tell it to reload that file. And this time it's going to say, I can't find it. If the page you're requesting cannot be served because of the extension configuration. In other words, the file exists, but IIS is telling me I don't know how to send it to you. If it's a script, I need to add a handler for it. So if this is supposed to be executable code, like a Cold Fusion file or an ASP file, I need to tell IIS, here's the code that will actually process that script. If the file is meant to be downloaded, I have to add a MIME map. And that's what this was. Down here, MIME maps, MIME types, these are the MIME maps. So because I've removed CSV, IIS can no longer serve that file type. That's why IIS comes with all these built-in extensions. Like this is a Microsoft Access database for Access 2000, Access 2007 and later. You'll find docx in here as well for Microsoft Word. There's docx. Doc, older, is also an application MS Word. You'll notice this one is slightly different MIME type. XML open formats, Office document, blah, 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 blah. I can edit that to see the whole thing. It's a word processing document, blah, 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 blah. So that'll tell the browser, and on the browser's end, the browser has to have a list of these things that says, hey, this MIME type is handled by this application. When you install applications like Microsoft Word, they can inform Windows in the registry of the MIME types that they're able to deal with. And so that's how it all gets connected. I request the docx file. IIS sends this MIME type ahead of the file. The browser receives that MIME type, looks it up in the registry to see who deals with that MIME type, and then launches the necessary application to display that. You can't just go sticking files in here, though. Let's say our company has got a custom document type called a QED file. Well, let's scroll down. There's the S's, there's the R's. Yeah, there's no QED. So if I wanted people to download QED files, I'm going to have to add a MIME type. Typically, again, you do that at the top level. I don't like messing with them on an individual basis because having every single website with a different MIME configuration just gets confusing. If it's possible to configure it at the server level, I find that that's a lot easier to do. Those are probably the main basic settings within IIS. Now, authentication is important, but we're going to talk about authentication in a lot more detail in nugget number 8. So we're not going to cover that now. And a lot of these other things are things that for a typical website you don't get into. So we're going to cover some of those in the advanced web server configuration in nugget number 11. But those are the basics. Now, where does that information get stored? In earlier versions of IIS, 6 and previous, there was something called the IIS metabase, which in version 6 of IIS was really just a big XML file that sat on disk. And every time you made changes, IIS would reread that XML file. Well, in 7 we got rid of the metabase, and instead we replaced it with these web.config files. Every website in its root folder has a web.config file. So let's open this. And we're going to have to tell it to open it with Notepad. And this is very simple. And this basically only includes the differences between the server level configuration and this site. So for static content, we've removed the file extension CSV. Now what if I decided, oh man, that was a mistake. I didn't mean to delete that. No problem. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to delete this from the web config file, save the web config file. Now if I go back into IIS Manager, sample site, MIME types, scroll down to the C's, I will see that CSV has come back. Because I never really deleted it. I just set a configuration option to say, hey, of all the things I inherited from the server level, I want you to remove the CSV. So when I took that out of the web config file, it is no longer removing that, and so I re-inherited it. So every website actually has very little in terms of configuration. It's just the differences. So you can edit a lot of stuff up here, and this is just the differences. Now, why do you need to know about that web config? There's a couple, if you go to an internet website and you're trying to figure out how to do something, and you find a website that describes it, there's two ways that the website author can choose to describe configuration. They could post a bunch of screenshots and tell you, okay, click on your website, screenshot, scroll down to IIS, screenshot, double-click MIME types, screenshot, scroll down to, so they can kind of walk you through it graphically, or they can just tell you what to stick in or take out of your web.config file. And it's much easier to, let's go in here, it's much easier for me to just post this on a website. Yeah. So go to the configuration section of your web config file and paste in this. Paste in this information. Text is very easy to publish online. So it's really useful. Anything you do in here will automatically be reflected in the GUI. So the GUI will reread the web config file. At worst, you may have to say refresh to force it to reread the file. That'll refresh the configuration and update the GUI to match. So it's really two ways of changing the configuration. The GUI is just a big wizard for modifying that web config file, for the most part. The server does maintain its own configuration, and that's where you'll see the definition for all of the sites and stuff like that. For the server-based configuration, I really prefer to stick with the GUI, just because the slightest wrong move, an extra angle bracket in the wrong place in the server config will take the entire server down, and you don't want to do that. Now, IIS is pretty smart. When you make a configuration change, even if it's just editing the metabase or the web config file directly, see, I'm still calling it metabase. Even if it's just editing the web config file directly, it knows to watch those files. And when you save the file, it will automatically reread it. So there's no need to restart the entire server, or even no need to restart an individual website most of the time. In this nugget, you've seen how to create a new website and get it up and running with the basic settings, how to configure the bindings so that the HTTP listener in kernel mode knows where to send the requests, how to set up virtual directories, how to configure logging, why those MIME types are important, and the differences between the site-specific configuration versus that master server-wide configuration. And we looked at the importance and location of those web config files. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.